The wind had a way of telling the truth out there on the Montana plain. It came down from the high passes in October with no apology and no comfort, sliding under the door of Eli Holt's cabin like something that had business being inside. He'd stopped fighting it the second winter after Clara died. Stopped stuffing rags into the gap beneath the door, stopped banking the fire the way she used to, stopped most things that had once seemed worth the effort. The cabin was warm enough to keep a man alive. That was all he asked of it now. He was 41 years old, and he moved through his days the way a stone moves through deep water, slowly, steadily, without much disturbance to anything around him. The ranch was small by the standards of the valley, 300 acres of mixed grass and creek bottom, a decent herd, a good dog named Roan, who slept by the stove and asked nothing of him that he couldn't give. Eli was grateful for the dog's company, in the way a man is grateful for a thing he cannot bring himself to name. He fed Roan first every morning. He did not feed himself until after. The neighbors, such as they were, the Pritchards 8 miles east, the Dunbar widow 12 miles north, along the creek, had stopped trying to draw him out after the second year. You could see it in the way they greeted him at the trading post in Harlow's Crossing. Polite, cautious. The way you'd greet a man standing too close to the edge of something. He didn't blame them. He wouldn't have known what to say to himself either. It was Walt Pritchard who first put the notion in his head, though Eli would later swear it had been the worst idea he'd ever agreed to. They were sitting on the post steps in September, waiting for the freighter, and Walt had pulled a folded newspaper from his coat with the careful reverence of a man producing evidence. "There's agencies," Walt said, in the quiet way he said most things, "back east. Women looking for a fresh start. Honest arrangements. A man writes a letter. They write back. If it takes, they come out." Eli had looked at the notice without touching it, the way you look at a thing you're not sure is real. Matrimonial correspondence welcomed. Respectable women of good character seeking frontier life and steady partnership. "I'm not lonely," he said, because that was the lie he kept most ready. Walt folded the paper and put it away. "Didn't say you were." Eli thought about it for 6 weeks before he wrote the letter. He wrote it badly, crumpling 4 attempts before producing something he wasn't ashamed of, though it was short and plain and probably told a woman more about his silences than his words. He said he had land. He said he had a working ranch. He said he was a man of his word, that he drank moderately, that he would not raise a hand to a woman in anger, because his father had done that, and he had spent his life being the opposite of his father. He said he was not a man given to declarations, but that he meant what he said when he said it. He sent the letter to the agency in St. Paul and did not expect an answer. The answer came in November. Her name was Nora Voss. She wrote in a small, careful hand on paper that smelled faintly of something he could not identify, some herb or pressed flower tucked into the envelope that had long since dried to nothing. She said she was 34. She said she was from Ohio originally, though she had lived the last several years in Chicago. She said she was capable and willing to work, that she knew how to keep a house and a kitchen garden, that she was not afraid of hard weather or hard work. She did not say much about herself beyond the practical, but there was one line near the end that Eli read 3 times, standing in the yard with the cold coming down and Roan pressing against his leg. "I am not looking for rescue," she wrote. "I am looking for ground solid enough to stand on." He wrote back the same evening. He told her to come. She arrived on the 16th of February, on a Thursday, on the afternoon stage from Billings. Eli had driven the wagon into Harlow's Crossing that morning, with no particular feeling about it, or so he told himself. He'd told himself the same thing all week, through the routine of the ranch, feeding cattle in the gray pre-dawn, breaking ice on the creek, mending fence in the cold, with his hands aching and his mind carefully, deliberately empty. He arrived at the stage, stopped an hour early, and waited in the wagon with his collar turned up, and Roan beside him watching the road. The stage was late. It always was in February. He watched 2 other passengers collect their parcels and go. And then the driver was handing down a woman's bag, and there she was on the step of the stage, and Eli understood, in the space of a breath, that something had gone wrong. She was slight in a way that looked recent, as though her frame had once held more weight than it currently did. Her coat was good quality, but thin for Montana February, the kind of coat that said she had underestimated the climate, or had not had the means to prepare for it, and he could not yet tell which. She moved carefully, getting down from the stage step, carefully in the way of someone managing pain. They are determined not to show, and she stood in the snow and looked around the street with eyes that were dark and steady and older than her face. He got down from the wagon. He was aware of how he must look to her, large, weathered, a man who had forgotten how to compose his expression into anything reassuring. He stopped a few feet from her and took off his hat. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Holt." Her voice was clear and even. She looked at him the way he imagined she looked at most things, directly with assessment but without panic. "You're cold," he said, because it was obvious and because he didn't know what else to say. "I've been cold before," she said, not as a complaint, as information. He put her bag in the wagon and helped her up, and she accepted the help without making anything of it. He draped his heavy coat over her legs without asking, and she looked down at it and then out at the street, and she said, "Thank you." He could see her jaw was tight against the shivering she wasn't going to let him see. He clicked the horse forward, and they drove out of town into the gray afternoon, and neither of them spoke for a long while, and somehow that was all right. The silence between them was not comfortable, exactly, but it was honest. She was asleep before they reached the valley turnoff. She had tried not to be. He could feel it the way she kept pulling herself back from the edge of it, sitting straight, looking out at the tri-line, but the warmth of the coat and the motion of the wagon had undone her. Her head tipped slowly to the side until it rested against his shoulder, and he felt the weight of her there, the unfamiliar human warmth of another person's sleep, and he held himself very still for the rest of the drive so she wouldn't wake. He had not been this close to another person in 4 years. When they turned up the lane and the cabin came into view, she stirred and straightened and looked at the building without expression. He wondered what she saw. A weathered square of wood and mud mortar with smoke coming from the chimney. A barn that needed painting. Fenced pasture running east to the dark line of the creek. Not much. "It's plain," he said. "Plain is fine," she said quietly. "Plain doesn't lie to you." He had prepared the cabin the only way he knew how, practically. He'd put fresh bedding on the cot in the back room that had been used for storage since Clara's time. He'd laid in a week's worth of provisions. He'd cleaned the place, which had taken 2 full days and revealed corners of the floor he had not seen in years. He showed her the room, and she stood in the doorway and took it in, and he watched something in her shoulders ease so slightly that he might have imagined it. "I'll sleep in the barn," he said, "until we've had time to." "You don't have to do that," she said. "It's your house. It'll be warmer out here than in the barn," he said, which was true and which was also not the only reason. "I sleep on the floor near the stove most nights anyhow." She looked at him then, that direct look, searching for something. She must have found it, or decided to believe it, because she nodded. "All right," she said. "Thank you." She ate the supper he'd made, salt pork and beans and cornbread, with the concentration of someone who had been hungry for longer than a day, eating slowly and deliberately, the way a person eats when they know better than to rush. He didn't comment on it. He filled her bowl a second time, without asking, and set it in front of her and went back to the stove. She was sick that first night. He heard her through the thin wall, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the muffled carefulness of someone determined not to disturb anyone, and he got up and heated water and knocked softly, and left a cup of ginger tea outside the door without a word. In the morning it was gone, and she had washed the cup. She came out of her room in the gray pre-dawn looking pale and composed. And she said, "I apologize for the disturbance." "There was no disturbance," he said. She looked at him with that searching look again, and then she sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the coffee cup he put in front of her, and the color began to come back into her face, by degrees like the sky before dawn, and he went out to feed the cattle and gave her time to collect herself. He would learn, over the days that followed, to read the pace of her recovery by small signals. Whether she ate standing at the counter or sitting at the table, whether the lines around her eyes were tight or loose, whether she held her left side when she thought he wasn't watching. He was always watching. Not obviously, but a man who had spent years reading weather and cattle and the 1,000 small signals of a working landscape had learned to see without appearing to. The story of how she'd come to be there came out the way the early spring does in Montana, not all at once, but in small advances and retreats. A thaw and then a freeze, and then another thaw a little farther each time. She had been married before. That came out the second week quietly, with no drama. She said it the way you say a thing you have decided to stop being ashamed of. I was married in Chicago, she said, for 4 years. He didn't ask what happened. He waited, which he had learned was not the same thing as indifference. He was a man who believed that what belonged to him could be treated however he chose, she said. She was looking at the window, at the snow coming down, and her voice was even. I disagreed. Eventually, I disagreed loudly enough to leave. The bruise he'd noticed on her left forearm when she reached past him for the flour tin on the second day. The way she'd flinched, barely, when he'd come in too quickly through the back door one afternoon. The measured caution with which she moved through a space he occupied. He understood now what he'd understood then but had not named. A man who would do that, he said, and then stopped, because he didn't have the words for what he meant, and words had never been his instrument anyway. She looked at him. He doesn't know where you are, he asked. He doesn't know I exist anymore, she said. That's the plan, he nodded. He got up and put another log on the fire. He said without turning around, No one's going to come here for you? Not while I'm standing. The silence behind him lasted long enough that he thought she might not answer. You don't know me, she said finally. I know enough, he said. March came in grudgingly, the way it does in that part of the country, with snowstorms that felt personal, and then a day of such clear, pale light that the whole valley looked made of glass. Nora had begun to settle into the rhythms of the place, and he watched the transformation with the careful attention of a man watching something delicate take root in difficult soil. She was in the kitchen garden most mornings now that the worst of the cold had eased. Crouching over beds she'd started under the south window, studying seed catalogs with the focused pleasure of someone who had forgotten they were allowed to plan for the future. She'd reorganized the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that he'd noticed only in retrospect. Everything moved to a position that made more sense. Every pot hung where a person could reach it without stretching. The herbs he'd bought in town at her request arrayed in small pots along the sill. She'd begun talking more. Not a great deal. She was not a garrulous woman, but in the easy, incremental way of a person who had remembered that conversation was not automatically dangerous. She asked him questions about the ranch, about the cattle, about how the land had come to him, and she listened to his answers with real attention, nodding sometimes, asking follow-up questions that showed she had understood and retained what he'd said. He was not used to being listened to. He found it unsettling in the way that unexpected kindness is often unsettling. One evening in late March, they were sitting after supper in the yellow lamplight. She with her mending and he with the accounts ledger that he hated and avoided, and always eventually returned to. The wind was up outside, pressing against the cabin with its old insistence. Rowan was stretched across both their feet under the table, which had become his habit, as though the dog had decided the arrangement was established, and he was simply confirming it. Tell me about Clara, she said. He looked up from the ledger. She was not looking at him. She was pulling a length of thread through the eye of a needle, slowly, with concentration. She was my wife, he said. I know that much. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the numbers that meant nothing to him now. She was a good woman, a brave woman. She came out here with me when this was nothing but raw land and weather, and difficulty, and she never complained, not once. Not in the 3 years we had. He paused. The fever took her fast, that's the mercy of it, I suppose. It was fast. Nora set down her mending. You've been alone 4 years. Yes, and you've been punishing yourself for it. He looked up at her. She held his gaze without apology. You think she'd want that? She asked. Not unkindly, like a person who knows the answer and is asking anyway, because the question is the thing that needs saying. He had no answer for that. He looked back down at the ledger. But he felt the question settle somewhere in him, the way a true thing settles, with weight. Spring arrived with its usual extravagance, the whole valley running with snowmelt, the creek loud and turbulent between its banks, the grass coming up pale and urgent. Nora's kitchen garden was showing green and rose, and she stood at the fence each morning and regarded it with an expression he could only describe as fierce, as though she were defying something. He was beginning to understand her secrets by their shapes, the way you understand weather by reading the land before it arrives. The too careful way she counted money, The checking of the door latch at night that she thought he didn't hear. The absence of any mention of family, any letter sent or received, any longing mentioned for anywhere or anyone she had left behind. She had carved herself free of her previous life with the clean precision of a surgical cut, and she had bled for it, and she had not let it stop her. He respected this with an intensity that surprised him. He had not expected to admire her. He had expected he did not know what he had expected. He did not know what he had expected. Usefulness, perhaps. Companionship of the practical kind, someone to fill the silent rooms. What he had not expected was a woman whose quiet intelligence illuminated his own life to him, in ways he had ceased to notice. A woman whose small daily acts of determination reminded him, by contrast, of all the ways he had stopped fighting for his own. He found himself talking more, not performing talk, not the social maintenance of the trading post, but actual conversation, the kind that opens something rather than closing it. He told her about the land, the way he'd come to understand its particular moods and needs over the years. He told her about his father, carefully selecting only what was necessary, the violence of the man, the long shadow he cast, and the decision Eli had made at 18 to become something else entirely, to build rather than destroy. Even if he hadn't always known what he was building or why, she listened to all of it. She did not offer false comfort or quick reassurance. She said when he'd finished the story about his father, "That must have cost you something." Deciding that, "Everything costs something," he said. "Yes," she said, "but some things are worth the cost." It was Earl Dunbar who started the talk in town. Earl was a particular kind of man that the frontier produced in some quantity, a man who dressed his cruelty in civic concern, who spoke of propriety and reputation while meaning control and diminishment. He'd seen Nora at the trading post in April when Eli had brought her in for provisions, and had watched her with the flat, assessing look of a man cataloging potential. Within a week, the word was through Harlow's Crossing that Eli Holt's mail-order woman had a past, that she'd left a husband in Chicago, that a respectable man ought to know better than to bring that kind of trouble into the valley. Eli heard it from Walt Pritchard, who told him plainly and without embellishment, because that was Walt's way. "What's the feeling in town?" Eli asked. "Mixed," Walt said. "The women mostly have sense enough not to throw stones. Dunbar's got a few of the men wound up." "Dunbar doesn't have a reputation that merits him spending much time on mine," Eli said. "No," Walt agreed. "But men like that don't need permission." Eli drove home that afternoon with a particular quality of silence that meant he was working through something. He told Nora that evening, directly, without softening it. She had a right to know. She received it without flinching, but he watched her hand still on the table and the careful way she breathed for a moment before she looked up. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to bring this to you." "You didn't bring it," he said. "It was here before you. Men like Dunbar are always here." He looked at her. "Are you afraid?" She considered the question with the honesty that was characteristic of her. "I'm tired," she said, "not afraid. Tired of being a thing that men discuss without asking my permission." "Then let's not give them much more to discuss," he said. But trouble arrived, as it so often does, in the form of a letter. It came on a Wednesday in May, forwarded through the agency in St. Paul, which was the only thread connecting her old life to her new one. She brought it in from the mailbox and stood at the kitchen window reading it, and he watched her face go from color to white and back to a careful stillness that told him everything. "It's my husband," she said. "My former husband. He's hired someone to find me." He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. He did not reach for the letter. He waited. "He says..." She stopped, started again. "He says I took property that belonged to him when I left. He means myself." She set the letter down on the counter with great precision, as though it were a thing that required careful placement. "He's filed a complaint with the county in Chicago. He has money and connections and a great many people who will believe him over me." "What does he want?" Eli asked. "He wants me to come back." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it, actual physical presence. "No," Eli said. She looked at him. Her eyes were very bright and very steady. "It's not as simple as..." "No," he said again. "This is not negotiable, Ellie." She used his name rarely. He noticed every time. "I am not asking you to fight my battles. I came here to stand on my own ground. I have to decide this. "You're right," he said carefully. "You do. And I am telling you, as a man who has said he meant what he said, whatever you decide, you will not face it alone. If he comes here, he comes to this house, and this house is mine, and you are under its roof, and there is nothing in this world that will make me stand aside while a man who raised his hand to you takes one more thing from you." Her chin lifted slightly. Something moved across her face. Not relief, exactly. Something deeper than relief. Recognition, perhaps, of something she had given up believing existed. "I left everything behind," she said quietly. "Everything. I came here with almost nothing, and even that wasn't enough. Because he always finds. He hasn't found you," Eli said. "He's found a forwarding address through an agency that no longer has your location. He's fishing." He watched her. "You're safer here than you know." She looked out at the yard, the garden, the open reach of the valley. The spring light lay flat and golden across the grass. "I didn't want to be a burden to you," she said. "You are not a burden," he said. "You are not a problem to be managed. You are a person who has earned the right to safety, and if you will allow it, I would like very much to be part of how you keep it." She turned to look at him fully. She had the expression of a woman who has been cautious for so long that trust has become almost incomprehensible. "Why?" she asked. He thought about it. He was not a man who answered quickly, and she knew this now and waited. "Because you came here," he said. "You came here with almost nothing, and you planted a garden. You reorganized my kitchen so that everything was where it made sense to be. You asked me about Clara, and you listened to the answer without flinching. You looked at this plain and difficult life, and you chose it day by day when you could have decided it wasn't worth the effort." He paused. "A person who does that is worth fighting for. That's all I know how to say." The silence held. Then, very quietly, she said, "I think I am going to stay." "Good," he said. "Then stay." They were married in June, at the trading post in Harlow's Crossing, with Walt Pritchard as witness and the circuit preacher who came through every other month presiding over a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes and required nothing from either of them but the truth. Nora wore a blue dress she'd made from fabric she'd chosen herself, and she stood very straight and said her words in a clear voice, and Eli said, "His is," and the preacher shook their hands, and Walt's wife Martha, who had appeared without explanation carrying a pound cake and a wide determined smile, cried quietly into her handkerchief. Earl Dunbar watched from across the street. Neither Eli nor Nora looked at him. The response to her former husband's inquiry came from a lawyer Walt Pritchard knew in Billings, a man who wrote letters of such impeccable and ice-cold legal precision that they tended to conclude matters without further discussion. The matter was concluded. She did not cry when she heard. She stood in the kitchen garden with her hands in the dirt, and she closed her eyes and tipped her face up to the sky for a long moment, as though receiving something she had forgotten was possible. Then she opened her eyes and went back to the planting. Summer arrived in its full and generous way, the valley running long and golden all the way to the mountains, the grass thick, the cattle doing well, the garden producing, with the kind of extravagant abundance that felt like an argument for persistence. Nora put up preserves and dried herbs and made the cabin smell of things that were warm and alive, and the cabin held these smells the way it had never held them in the years of Eli's solitary keeping. He found, to his genuine surprise, that he was not merely enduring his days. He was in them, present in them, in the way he had once been, before grief had converted living into a form of waiting. He noticed things again, the quality of morning light across the east pasture, the particular colors of the late summer hills, the way the creek sounded different in August than in May, the thousand small and irreplaceable specifics of the place he had built his life in. He noticed Nora. He noticed the way she laughed, seldom but real, a laugh that had nothing performative in it, surprised out of her by something genuinely absurd. He noticed the way she thought, carefully, thoroughly, with a precision of moral attention that he recognized as kin to his own. He noticed the way she looked at the mountains when she thought herself unobserved, with an expression of such uncomplicated peace that it made something in his chest ache with something he had stopped calling by its right name. He called it by its right name one September evening, sitting on the porch in the cooling air while roan stretched across their feet and the first stars were coming out over the mountains. "I love you," he said. Not as a speech, not as a moment he'd prepared. simply a fact that had grown too certain to remain unspoken. She was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid I'd forgotten how to let someone," she said. "I know," he said. "I was too. Are you still afraid?" He considered this. The stars were coming out in earnest now, the way they do in Montana, vast and without apology. "No," he said, "not anymore." She reached over and took his hand in both of hers and held it on her knee. And they sat like that in the quiet evening while the stars multiplied and the valley filled with the soft sounds of its own living, the creak and the wind and the particular contentment of Roan's breathing. And neither of them needed to say anything further, because the silence between them was no longer the silence of emptiness, but of sufficiency, of two people who had carried their damages alone for long enough and who had found, in this plain and difficult and beautiful place, that those damages could be held together rather than apart. He had thought, when Walt Pritchard showed him that newspaper notice on the post steps in September, that he might be acquiring a practical arrangement, a presence, something to address the specific vacancy in the rooms. He had not understood that he was opening a door. He had not understood that what he had taken for loneliness was, in fact, a long waiting, the way the land waits through winter for the particular season that belongs to it. He had not understood that she would come in and reorganize not only his kitchen but the deeper rooms of him, placing things where they made sense, making possible a kind of order and warmth and light that he had long since stopped believing he deserved. He had not understood that saving and being saved could be the same act between two people, or that the ground solid enough to stand on was not a thing you found alone. She had come looking for ground. She had come looking for ground. He had been the ground all along. And she, without announcement, without ceremony, in the quiet accumulative way of all true and necessary things, had taught him how to stand on it again. The wind came down from the passes that night with something different in it. Not the cold insistence of it, the indifference, the old lonely truth it used to tell. Something else. Something that moved through the valley and across the pasture, and around the walls of the small plain cabin, where two lights burned warm in the window. Something that sounded, if you listened in a particular way, less like an ending, and more, at long last, like a beginning.